morning, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come here, especially on a Saturday morning. So to come talk to us about mixed use in Burbank. My name is Lindsay Hagan. I'm a senior planner with the City of Burbank, and I'm overseeing this project through this process. I'm also here today with the assistance of most of our planning staff, as well as a consultant team who I will introduce later. Some housekeeping before we get started. There's some light refreshments in the back of the room, so feel free to grab those at any point throughout the workshop. And there's restrooms kind of out these double doors and to the left. There were also some handouts and comment cards that were at the sign-in. So you're welcome to take those. The flyer does have my contact information, and then the comment cards are for you guys to provide any additional comments through this process, and you can turn them back into us at the end of the workshop. So the objective of today's workshop is to provide you with an overview of the mixed-use development project. And process, including what we're tasked with and why we're doing it. We will also be providing you with some overall information about mixed-use types, places, and styles so that we can be building on the same information and terms today at today's workshop. And then through the two workshop activities we have set up, we want to get your preferences on mixed-use kind of design elements for key planning areas of the city in Burbank. And this is going to be what the basis is for developing these standards moving forward. So in terms of what to expect this morning, this is kind of a brief agenda. Essentially, I'm going to be providing an overview for the next 10 minutes, kind of the background of the project. Then I'm going to hand it off to David Sargent from Sargent Town Planning, who is one of the project consultants, and he will be providing an overview on the mixed-use place types. And then we will also be having an activity around that in the small groups. And then moving forward from that, we will talk about mixed use in Burbank and the specific planning areas that we're focusing on. And then also follow that up with another activity, which will be stations as you see around the room. And from there, we will bring back the group and have some closing remarks and let you guys know what we're going to be doing with the information we get today. So a key part of this process is your involvement. We currently have information on our city website with a link listed here. And just to let you know, this PowerPoint as well as the poster boards and information from today's workshop will be on the city's website this upcoming week. And then we will be launching a project-specific website by the end of this month that will have a lot more information and ways to stay engaged through this process. And then also following, aside from the websites, we will be having multiple rounds of public meetings with the planning board and city council on this project, as well as for those who can't attend today's workshop, we will also be basically taking the questions and discussion points that we go over today. We'll be putting those in an online survey so people who were not able to attend could provide feedback that way. So in order for us to really begin talking about mixed use, I wanted to ensure we were all kind of using some of the same definitions and terms. So mixed use is really a place that incorporates multiple uses. It could be residential, commercial, institutional, industrial, and it really takes many forms from anything from a single building on a single site to multiple properties and buildings within a city block, or even along kind of a mile stretch of a street corridor. There are actually a lot of examples today of mixed use in Burbank, both stuff that has developed naturally over decades and then newer stuff, particularly in the downtown. So why are we talking about mixed use development standards? The answer is really simple. There are no standards for mixed use development today. So individual developments that are reviewed by the city are done on a case-by-case basis, where staff is basically using two different zoning standards, kind of residential and commercial, and trying to blend them. So they're really not intended to be combined. They're not designed that way. So what it ends up resulting in is individual plan developments for each project where they each have slightly different requirements and standards. So this process is not really efficient. It also doesn't send a clear kind of message, or doesn't send a clear message basically of what the city's expectations are for this type of development. And it doesn't really allow for much consistency among projects. So in addition to those reasons, in general, the Burbank 2035 General Plan, which is the 25-year vision for the city, does outline many goals and policies about sustainability and walkable neighborhoods, and mixed-use places is a way to kind of implement some of those goals and policies. So what exactly is the project? Well, so through this process and through the input that we received tonight, we want to get a clear vision for what the community's expectations are for mixed-use development through the creation of these development standards. And these standards can include things like building frontage at the street, so what does it look like? How much visibility is there into the building from the street? There could be amenities, what type of spaces exist in these mixed-use places along the sidewalk, adjacent to the building, or even in between buildings. Public spaces, what does the sidewalk look like? Is it a wide open sidewalk? Does it have outdoor dining? Also design, architectural features, design as well as coverings or overhangs. And then pathways, where are these pathways going? Where do we desire them? And what do they look like? So the end product will be these development standards, which would result in a zoning text amendment to Title 10 of the City Municipal Code. And the intent is that if it is adopted by council, then it would mean that when project applicants submit projects that are mixed use in the 3 planning areas, which we'll talk about in a moment, then they would be required to implement these development standards. So in terms of where we're looking, it's these 3 specific plan areas in the city where all 3 of these areas, mixed use is either already permitted as a use or is being considered or studied. So it's also the area of the city where we're getting the most applications currently for mixed use projects. So this includes the Burbank Center, which is the downtown. It also includes the Downtown Transit Center, which is on the other side of 5. And then it also includes the Media District and the Golden State Specific Plan, which is a plan that's currently under development and in review with the city. It's a plan that is looking at potentially introducing housing or mixed use in that area, which is kind of surrounding the airport. And includes the Metrolink area as well. So we wanted to make sure and get input, since we're talking about mixed use, in that area as well. This project doesn't include any modifications to land uses in these areas at all, or building heights or parking standards. This really is about design elements of these mixed use buildings, particularly at the street. That's really the primary focus, and that's really where these standards are really geared towards. It doesn't include either any of the existing corridors, so Burbank Boulevard, Magnolia Boulevard, or Olive Avenue. These are areas where the city is going to be undergoing a series of city parking standard studies, if you will, where we're going to be looking at parking behavior as well as needs in those areas before we so we can get some additional information about that. So that kind of covers the 3 areas. David Sargent will be talking about each of them later in this presentation. So what will mixed use standards do? Really, they'll help create the vibrant, walkable neighborhoods that are kind of outlined and discussed in the policies and goals of the general plan. It'll focus on these 3 areas where we are receiving a lot of interest for mixed use, and it will still be able to maintain and protect and preserve the single-family neighborhoods surrounding. Additionally, it'll provide the clear guidance to the development community of what the city and community expects, what our interests are. And then also it will help us through this process clearly define what does mixed use look like in Burbank. In terms of how this project is funded, it's through a grant. The California Strategic Growth Council funds statewide programs that are oriented towards reducing greenhouse gases and improving the environment. And so through that program, the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, was awarded a grant for 6 cities in their projects, one of which is Burbank in this project. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch base on the project schedule. So there was a handout that has a more detailed schedule, but generally speaking, this project was started last year with some background analysis that was done. There was a series of planning board and city council study sessions. Now we're at the kind of visioning phase. We want to understand what the vision is for mixed use in Burbank. So that includes today's workshop. So after today's workshop, we will take this information and move forward with going to a planning board study session as well as city council study session. And then from there, we will have, hopefully at that point, a very clear vision of what the mixed use standards are. And then begin actually developing the framework and drafting the standards, in which we'll have another community workshop, which is anticipated in the middle of January. And from there, go to another round of study sessions with the planning board, and then from there, release a public draft of the standards, which are anticipated sometime in March of next year. And then there will be a period in which we'll post them online, and so we'll have a public comment period as well as have another study session with the planning board, and then conclude with a final draft and final public hearings with the planning board and city council. So on that note, I will go ahead and transfer it over to David.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, very nice to see you folks. Thank you for taking, as Lindsay said, time out of a beautiful Saturday morning to be here and talk to planning nerds about this subject. We're very interested in it. I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to do 2 short little presentations, in between which we'll hope that you guys can talk about what you think of the ideas that we're showing, and ideas that we may not show but you might be interested in as well. And then we're going to talk in the second bit about the areas, the 3 areas that are being focused on here. We think in terms of mixed-use buildings and mixed-use projects, we think mostly in terms of mixed-use places. I mean, cities were originally, the reason we had cities in the first place was so that people could live near places where they could work and shop before everybody had cars that let them move around through the region on a daily basis. So really a lot of what mixed-use so as Lindsay said, mixed-use standards are about providing guidance for the kinds of development that zoning codes forgot about from the 50s until fairly recently, where everybody got excited about being able to drive and set cities up so that you just needed to. So this is about making places where driving is optional and using your feet is also a good option. So the purpose is to bring amenities that you like, shopping, parks, schools, and jobs within walking distance or biking distance of where you live, or letting you live nearer those things. And it provides more opportunities for local serving businesses, because people are more connected to the place around them and less likely to shop in the next city on a daily basis. It can help attract residents who hadn't really thought about living in Burbank, because there weren't the kinds of places or housing that they were looking for in Burbank. You have a lot of people who work here, who are sort of younger people who like to ride their bikes and walk around, and providing ways that they can actually live in Burbank and work in Burbank and not have to be, commuting in from Palmdale, could be a big economic help to the city and an environmental help. Reducing traffic congestion by allowing people to not drive every time they want to do something. And supporting transit stations and making transit into a viable option rather than something that you only do if your car broke down. I ride Metrolink through Burbank almost every day. So traditional mixed use was just simply nice, useful shops near or on the edge of your neighborhood where you and your neighbors could get together and have lunch or a cup of coffee. In traditional mixed-use places, the active public space is the foreground and the buildings are the background. We're making standards in this round for buildings, but the purpose of having these kinds of buildings is to allow and encourage community to break out in the spaces in between them. Modern mixed-use places include making buildings, systematically making buildings that have lively ground floor, lively, useful, attractive, comfortable ground floor spaces with, in many cases, not all cases, housing or offices or something up above them. And again, the payoff is generating places where people come together. And it can be traditional architecture. It can also be beautiful modern architecture that brings really successful retail ground floors and really luxurious lofts into the same place. So, really? Huh. Something like this always happens. This is not my computer. And it doesn't want to go to the next slide. Let's see. Oh, dear me. That's harsh. Computer's telling me it wants to update itself. Anybody have an idea how to make this computer? Windows is sad. Oh, there. Oh, there. Let's see. Ah, another slide. How exciting. Okay. So, there we go. Now it's back. So this is just a diagram of sort of the whole range of kinds of places there are. There's countryside, there's farms, there's sort of semi-rural neighborhoods on the edge of town, there's single-family detached neighborhoods, which you have so many lovely ones of. There's centers where things are closer together, like some of your corridors. There's downtowns, and then there's big districts like employment districts, industrial districts, stuff like that. Mixed use happens can happen in these districts. It can happen in a big city downtown. It can happen in your downtown. It can happen around the edges of your downtown. It can even happen in sort of transitional parts of your neighborhood where multifamily or townhouses occur near your houses. And then there's big areas of town that mixed use just doesn't happen in. And then you've got corridors that pass through. And we're not talking specifically about the corridors. As Lindsay said, those are complicated because those are places where commercially zoned land is close to single-family houses, and there's all kinds of things to worry about. Buildings being too big, people parking in front of your house, all that stuff. So we're not talking about those today, but we want to just touch on that because over time here, you're going to think about how to do mixed use in all those kinds of places. So just knowing that that's coming up, I think, is helpful. So we'll start with that. This is not what we're making standards for, but just to help people think about mixed use as sort of coming in small, medium, and large. So you've got the edges of neighborhoods where mixed use can be as simple as a nice little coffee shop at the end of your street. I live in a pure single-family neighborhood, and 2 blocks away there's like 5 restaurants and 2 hospitals. So that's mixed use, but it's not a mixed use building, and we're not dealing with that explicitly in these standards, but it's an important subject. And it can bring businesses close to your neighborhoods, and the buildings stay sort of small. Along the design priorities are that it needs to be safe and comfortable for pedestrians. The frontage, we're going to talk about that a lot. The frontages of the buildings, basically the ground floor of the building next to you when you're walking by. That is more important than everything else. If you only get one thing right in your whole city, get that right, and you'll be way ahead of the game. The building heights have to not be too big. There's sort of a rule of planning, not too big, not too close. So that's a lot of what this is about, is making sure that you have useful things near you, but not too near and not too big. Parking is usually not in, you don't have parking lots in front of these buildings like you do for strip centers. And they need to make easy, comfortable places to walk to and spend time. Pretty much, that's the same thing. Multiple pictures, I'm sorry, I lost my flow there. So sidewalks like that, little buildings with really cool stuff. 1 and 2 story buildings can be traditional, they can be modern. 2-story buildings, this is Santa Barbara, pretty nice example. Coffee shop, apartments upstairs, active uses on the streets. This is larger scale on larger scale corridors. This is in Pasadena, that's a bigger corridor, so you have a bigger building on it. Centers are really sort of a cousin of corridors. Centers tend to happen like at a major intersection of 2 corridors, where you've got bigger lots, you can have bigger stuff. You can have stuff that's big enough that you wouldn't want it just too close to your house, but it would be really nice to have it 3 or 4 blocks away. They can provide bigger opportunity. You can have some bigger stores there, could have a grocery store, dry cleaners, stuff like that. And they provide comfortable environments for people to come enjoy their life outside their house. This is an example of a center. This is actually built about 15 years ago near a transit stop in the west side of Portland, Oregon. It's got beautiful neighborhood serving commercial uses on the ground and really spiffy loft apartments upstairs. It can take this sort of, centers can take this sort of form. Again, just a beautiful building at an intersection with a bunch of housing over some nice stores. This is actually in Laguna Beach. Beautiful ground floor stores with offices and or apartments upstairs. With a focus on pedestrian connectivity, often outdoor, in centers you very often have some sort of a plaza or an outdoor gathering space more than just the street. Sometimes it's just the street frontages. And sometimes you can have buildings at key intersections that really provide sort of a landmark and add a distinctive character to what used to be just sort of a garden variety intersection that gives your neighborhood your neighborhood center a different kind of identity. And they don't have to be 2-story, they can be 1-story. And it can just be a great shop at the end of your street where people gather. And then districts are the larger cousins of mixed use, and those are places where you have higher concentrations of commercial activity, like downtown Burbank is a very good example of a district that has been coming back over time. I mean, it never completely died, but it's been getting better over time. Many, many California towns and cities have centers that really just pretty much died. Where I live in Ventura, and 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, our downtown was just dead. And through careful planning and preparing mixed-use development standards, it's been coming back steadily. And yours has had a similar trajectory, and I think yours has a great opportunity to go farther because you're in the middle of a higher population density than many other places. The design priorities are lively, amenity-rich places. This is Pioneer Square in Seattle, one of the best district centers you'll find anywhere. And a mix of new construction standards and adaptive reuse standards are very important. There's a lot of buildings in districts like, well, here you've got some beautiful jobs of adaptive reuse. I think it's Urban Outfitters, if I'm remembering correctly. Am I right? Anyway, you've got some beautiful adaptive reuse. And the scale, okay, how big the buildings are depends on the city you're in. You know, too big is too big, but on the other hand, if you've got the transit and parking infrastructure to handle buildings at this scale, then having the opportunity for more people to live really close to all the amenities that you can have in a place like downtown Burbank, and having more customers, more everyday customers that don't bring a car with them and cause more parking problems. Getting that balance right is the trick, and every community has to decide how big is too big, and basically how many people can you let live in a cool place. This is probably too big. The focus here is on the public space, providing when you do have higher densities, having beautiful public open spaces for people to share becomes quite important, and having a lot of ways for them to get around other than driving is critically important. And you've already got a place that's really great. So we're gonna now ask you to just go through a few questions together around the table for how long? 20 minutes? Do you want to introduce us, Henry?
Thank you.
This is Henry Pontarelli.
Yeah, the next session or exercise is going to be about 20 minutes. I'm going to sit at the tables and talk about mixed use, and then come back. Each table will come back and report to the group what the highest priority issues. So this community engagement or going into the community and trying to assess your priorities and your perspective is a really big part of this project. There's a lot of time and resources being spent and invested in community engagement. We have had a couple public meetings with the planning board and city council. We've got this workshop. We've got another workshop in January. We got 4 more public sessions in front of the city council and the planning board. There's comment cards in the back. There's a website, Facebook page, and Twitter account that will be launched at the end of this month that will give the community a chance to learn what's going on in the project and be able to interact with the project. So grab a comment card. If there's something you forget this afternoon or this morning during these conversations or the breakout sessions, make sure you write those comments down and hand them to us. It's really important for the consultant team to understand what's going on in the community. It's really going to drive our research. It's going to influence our findings. It's going to influence our recommendations. So Dave and my firm, Lisa Wise Consulting, and are really dedicated to making sure that the community's voice is evident in our recommendations. So thank you. So again, we'll have 20 minutes at each of the 5 tables. And then at the end, each table will have like 3 minutes to report back on the highest priorities. And there's someone from the city and someone from our team or someone from our team at the tables taking notes. So try to have some fun. Oh, sorry, a recording. Do you guys want to be the first table? Table 1? Who's your representative? Who's your extreme representative?
I'll take a
Great.
crack at it. My name is Fred. I work for the city, but on behalf of the group here at Table 8, I'll just read through kind of the stuff that we talked about. One of the big things, we asked the question, what comes to mind when you talk about mixed-use development? And then we really didn't get a chance to go through all the questions because it was pretty robust discussion all the way through. But Lisa say, here's what we, some of the comments. Access to transit stops, connectivity, regional connections, as well as connections within the city are really key when we're looking at mixed-use development. So not just the buildings, but how we get to and from work and or venues that we want to go to. The shops, the restaurants, entertainment. There's a concern that mixed use is gentrification on steroids dropped into the city. The work industry, Burbank is a sleepy oasis. What is mixed use going to do to that? So the vision of what Burbank is now and what impact does mixed use have on that feeling of character and neighborhood that is something that people hold dear. Growth, it's understood that, or there's a concern that the mixed use is really focusing on a group like millennials. What about millennials that eventually have children? Where are those children going to go to school? The schools are impacted, especially Emerson and Jefferson in the area. So where would they go? We're referencing downtown, but it could be something that could be repeated in the other plan areas. Kids need access to schools and also the high school. So what happens when new development goes in and continues to congest the streets? What's going to happen? How is that dance going to happen where you've got people picking and dropping off their kids and you have new, whether it be commercial and residential uses occurring? There needs to be better integration in how we address those issues. And also, one of the notes I put in here is better coordination with the school too, as new development is happening. They like the local shops, the niche shops that exist in the area that they can go to. They want walkable streets, trees. There was reference to San Fernando Boulevard and kind of the tree canopy and the different businesses that are there. People like to walk up and down those streets. Better integration of the buildings into the neighborhood. There was concerns with hotel in proximity to the high school, which would be there on 3rd Street. And then also just the streets where currently there could be wider streets, but maybe they're better designed, or smaller streets that are less well designed, and therefore there's kind of variation there in the feel and the safety that people feel as they're walking or driving through those streets. Traffic continues to be a central issue. And then also safety at corners for both pedestrians as well as vehicles, and how that can be designed or looked at through these mixed-use development standards. There was talk about employment, and we know that there's basically a jobs to housing imbalance in the city, but then there's also employment that feeds certain industries that are in the city, but are actually around the city. So there's accessibility to and from work, both in the city as well as outside. So once again, greater connectivity for transportation and different forms of transportation are critical. There was discussion regarding, we should also survey the employers and the employees as far as whether they really want to live and work in Burbank, since mixed use could help facilitate that. There was discussion about different examples of good mixed use. Someone referenced the Pearl District in Portland, as well as other mixed-use projects in Seattle, and the fact that the success there is multi-generational, as well as, so you've got all ages wanting to come together for a different lifestyle, but at the same time, they want a lot of the neighborhood amenities that people hold near and dear in smaller areas, i.e. the niche shops, the open space, the public open space. And there's an understanding, of course, clearly that the mixed use will help increase the tax base, but we need to do it in a way where if we're going to allow mixed use, and mixed use has a different effect, that we're able to manage that growth and do it in an effective way and make it affordable, create greater opportunities for affordability within town, and then also look at different options. When we talk mixed use, I think there was a concern that all the imagery really looks at like big towers and glass, But what about townhomes or smaller types of what some people call missing middle, right? So the different types of mixes between your single-family residential lot to your mixed mid-rise. So they're wanting to see that be talked about as part of, and looked at as part of mixed use. And once again, we closed out with lack of transit. That was it.
Thank you. Nice job. Thank you very much. Maybe we can stick with the top 10 priorities because I think this is a really good exercise. It's important for us to hear this stuff, but maybe we could stick with the top 10 priorities that came out of the table. Thanks. Matt.
Okay, cool. So our table talked a lot of the same topics that you have there. As far as defining what mixed use is, it was a breakdown of current land use zoning, so it's more of an organic style of development. It's something that it's 24 hours a day. Not necessarily everything's open 24 hours a day, but it touches. You can do everything self-sustaining. You can walk to get groceries. You can walk to go get coffee. Walk to work. You can walk back home. Things like that. So there's less of a resilience or a reliance on the automobile. Some of the other things that are important are the tree canopy, parks, open spaces, plazas, public art, wide and safe sidewalks, universal access, multi-generational, so not just the young populations that work during the day, but amenities that are kid-friendly, amenities for the aging populations. There was also talk that this style development has less need for strict parking standards. So there was some examples that were talked about that maybe the parking standards that we have are too high. So because these areas are more walkable, they use transit facilities, things like that, there's less of a need for as many parking spaces. Or when we are building the parking spaces, looking at ways that they can be converted later, because the technology in autonomous vehicles is progressing. So what does it look like 20 years from now? Basically, things that are self-sustaining. So we can walk to small grocery stores. There's uniqueness to everything. Affordable housing, affordable commercial spaces for mom and pop places that help build the uniqueness. Things like that. And then some of the examples we used were Rome. They have essentially self-serving neighborhoods where you can do all those things. New York, Chicago, Vancouver, where they have a robust bicycle network, a lot of public transit, and it's pedestrian-oriented.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. You guys ready? Who's your representative? Lisa? Great. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. So we had the opportunity to hear from a number of folks who've lived in Burbank for a very long time. When we first brought up mixed use, the first thing that we heard was Glendale, our neighbors. People think about mixed use and young people, concerns about affordability, some questions about how successful existing mixed-use buildings we have are. Some curiosity about, well, do these work well? Do the units get filled? Some questions about, do we really need all this new housing? We already kind of have a vibrant downtown, and the questions about traffic and just more people with more cars. So when people were asked if they might live in a mixed-use community, at this table the sentiment was, not really for me. There's some concerns about privacy and not necessarily wanting to be bumping elbows with folks all the time. But as far as what might make for a nice mixed-use environment, one of the things we talked about was definitely having parks, even just small parks, and just smaller scale, so not necessarily everything being a huge mixed-use building. as well as it might be it might be nice to be near a coffee shop or the smaller mom and pop shops that we don't see as often. We talked a little bit about how places like the Americana are nice. Everything's just really high end. Let's see. There were also some concerns about schools, proximity to schools, and also capacity with our infrastructure and utilities and water services. So in general, as far as what would make the mixed-use buildings more successful, just again, if they were on a smaller scale, and then the opportunity for people to, even if they have a car, to have the option to walk sometimes. So maybe people are still driving, but they have options to take some trips by foot as well.
Thanks. Who's the representative here? Good? James?
Yes. So one of the main concepts we focused on was the idea of daily use, that we want to prioritize businesses, for instance, that people are going to use every day. So things like grocery stores, coffee shops, restaurants, etc. As far as other sorts of businesses beyond, say, food, we prioritize things that we can carry. So there's no need to abandon the idea of the mom and pop store or the niche store. We really just want to limit it to stores that provide smaller goods. So we don't want big box stores where people are going to be buying big appliances like refrigerators or washing machines, because the convenience of being able to walk to a store and then back home is kind of negated if you need a car to transport whatever it is you're buying. However, people are still going to have to buy those things. They're going to have to drive in order to get them. So parking is going to be an issue. We need to find a way to efficiently park a large number of cars without having to take up a large area, because that would defeat the purpose of a mixed-use development. We also focused on the concept of street use and street activation, and like some of the other groups, we focused on a model that Europe has. We talked a lot about Paris and how there's vibrant sidewalk activity. There's somewhat wider streets and then wider sidewalks so that people can sit outside at a coffee shop or a restaurant. One of the big positives that we noted for mixed-use development is that it improves environmental sustainability. By building more densely, we actually reduce our carbon footprint and create a more efficient use of water and power infrastructure. But we did recognize the need for green spaces so that people could, say, take their kids to a small park or go on a picnic or just enjoy the greenery, because a concrete jungle is not what we're looking for. We, however, came to the conclusion that having more people in a more dense area creates a stronger sense of community, even if you're not necessarily interacting with all of these people on a daily basis. Just having a community of people that live and work in close proximity to each other creates a more tightly knit group.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, Clarence, thank you.
Hello, I'm Clarence. For our table, we some of the topics that were already discussed, I won't go over because I know we're kind of running low on time, but one of the things we wanted to discuss also, or that was at this table, like a lot of concerns obviously was with parking. What is this going to do when we talk about infilling these three areas? Is it going to increase traffic for those who are already commuting to these areas? What's that going to do for them when they have that increased residents or employees in these areas? Also, one of the things is ingress, egress standards. What do we need to do so that doesn't cause more traffic and more vehicular problems for people when they're trying to use these spaces? Obviously, the intent is obviously trying to get the vehicle out, but like what a lot of people were saying, people are still going to have to use those vehicles if they're living in one place and having to commute to these other areas. Another thing that was brought up was, you talk about mixed use, retail on the bottom or office space, but one person brought up, what does that do to the person when they go by these retail spaces and you see a for sale or vacant or lease? What does that do for your psyche when you're walking down? You see these open spaces right now, and now you're increasing more retail or more spaces. What's that going to do for the psyche? That was just an issue that was brought up. And then also the future retail. When you have Amazon and all these places that's coming up, what's that going to do for the retail 20 years from now? Obviously, 2035, there's going to be a lot of things that's going to happen. So yes, the coffee space is great, all these local places, but how much retail do you need, or are you going to have a lot more vacant spaces? What's the experience going to be like? One thing that we did talk about, lightly touched on, was alleyways, the use of these small pedestrian scale. One thing we kept on referencing was Pasadena along Colorado Boulevard, just these little alleyways and just sort of the look and feel of that pedestrian feel. One thing that was also brought up was obviously with Verdugo, you hear that around the city, what they did with taking one lane out and reducing it to one lane and putting in the bike lane. Of course, some people for it, some people against it. So that was also brought up as well. And then also with the Golden State District, with the existing properties that are there now, are you going to eventually push these people out of these places in terms of the light industrial areas, or are you just basically working around these areas? And then, number one was obviously parking. What's going to be done for parking in terms of now that you're increasing more population in these tighter spaces, what's that going to do for the people, again, that's commuting to these places, that's trying to find a parking spot for where they work? So that's it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I think Dave's going to talk a little bit more.
Did we get each of the tables? Okay. Okay, cool. Good, thank you. Well, I'm going to just quickly go through just a quick description of the parts of Burbank where, as Lindsay said, the most interest in putting in mixed-use developments is occurring. And I'm just going to go through a few images that suggest what kinds of development could happen there. But there were very good comments and raised a lot of the main issues that one has to deal with when thinking about mixed-use places, including 2 points that stuck out in my mind is that housing at intermediate densities like townhouses and live-work units, something more dense than a house and less dense than a big apartment complex, probably has a lot to offer. We find that in most communities, that's a missing part. And that's a way to allow more people to live closer to amenities without overloading the system with huge projects. And the flip side of that is the concern about, well, what's happening with retail? Well, that's a very important question, and I know that where the discussion of mixed use has been in the past in Burbank has been focusing on mixed use projects more than it's focusing on mixed use places. So there's been in some cases, there's been the concern that you have to have retail on the ground floor in order for it to be mixed use. Well, you're never going to have a big new district where the whole ground floor is retail. There's just, as was pointed out, there's just not enough retail in the world to make that happen. So a bunch of the ground floors have to be something else, and there's only so many, how much coffee can you drink? So before you just, so as you think about making parts of Burbank, not all parts, certainly not the existing single-family neighborhoods, but selected parts of Burbank more walkable, where you can walk from where you live to amenities more easily and safely and comfortably on complete streets, etc. How do you balance the way you build buildings where the ground floor is residential with buildings where the ground floor is commercial? What we've been asked to focus on here is the biggest centers around the media district where you have already big buildings, around the downtown where you have already big buildings, and around the Golden State Center where you're not, for the most part, next to somebody's house, so you could have larger buildings. So the imagery that we showed you already and the imagery we're going to show you here is focusing intentionally on those larger buildings. But as we go forward in the thinking about this and showing you stuff at another workshop, we're going to also focus on those intermediate scale buildings where they're not necessarily all commercial on the ground floor, and think about making more complete mixed-use places that maybe happen on a scale that's comfortable in more places in Burbank where you wouldn't want the larger buildings we're showing. So clearly in the downtown there's opportunities to further enhance the commercial businesses along San Fernando Road. There'll probably be differences of opinion on how much more opportunity there is to add housing into the downtown. There are advantages of adding housing into downtown because that gives you more 24-hour customers or 18-hour customers, which then can support more businesses that you all want to go to when you have time. In some of the parts of town, there will be opportunities for adaptive reuse of older buildings. That may certainly be the case in some of the areas like around the Metrolink station on the other, the Burbank Center on the other side of the freeway, or around the Golden State District, where you may be adding in new amenities to a place that already has a lot of jobs. And making places that people want to gather through mixing new development with adaptive reuse of existing buildings. So, and as we mentioned before, you've already got the beginning. So there's within a district, you've got a potential range of intensities from 2-story to much taller. But in every case, the focus is on making the ground plane interesting and lively in these districts. That would not be the case as you get into the smaller centers or get closer to neighborhoods, but can be talked about at another time. There can be a potential range of architecture from traditional architecture to more modern architecture. But again, the thing in common is the attractive, walkable, useful ground floor. And then as each of these districts has centers that are away from houses, and then at some point on the edge they get closer to houses. So one of these posters that you're going to look at here in this next exercise has examples of smaller scale buildings that are probably appropriate as you get closer to the neighborhoods, because nobody wants the big tall stuff real close to their neighborhood, including me, even though I like buildings a lot. So the Media District already has a high concentration of jobs and some pretty big buildings. So perhaps the question is, and we want to hear from you about what the question is, but my question is, wouldn't it be a better place to work if you had more beautiful ground floor uses, so people come down to go to lunch, people have breakfast on the way in, people stick around after work, and then if there are opportunities for new housing right in there, might it be that would actually cut your traffic down because people who work there wouldn't have to commute in from so far, they could live near where they work. So buildings that have high quality housing and high quality ground floor retail amenities that would serve the employees during the day and the community at large in the evening. Gathering places for people to have lunch comfortably and dinner, and matching that with really truly beautiful ground floor outdoor spaces. Very often, as we were chatting about at this table, the reason to do mixed use development standards for Burbank is so that when developers invest and make their money, what they're making is the kind of Burbank you want. That's the reason to have standards. Right now you don't have any standards. So the tendency is for you to get what the developer wants. And these standards are a way for you to tell the developers, hey, wait a second, if you're going to make money doing mixed use development in our town, you're going to build stuff that we want to have. That's why we're here. And having them make money and provide opportunities for employment in the building, not just the construction jobs, and new housing options, and leave you with beautiful places to spend time, that has the potential for a win-win, and it's a matter of balancing those things. That's what these standards are intended to do, is strike a balance between intensification or change of use and what it leaves you in terms of a city to live in. And with the potential of beautiful new buildings, whether they're offices or housing, in association with there's a lot of cities that would just think they'd died and gone to heaven if they had the kind of employment and jobs opportunities that you have. We're working in a lot of cities that have spent decades trying to build an employment base that you already have. So the question is, how can you build on that economic engine to help make the place better? And focusing on the public spaces, the streets, the parks, and the amenities that the city that you come down into when you leave work, focusing on that is a great value addition possibility. The Golden State Employment District is a whole different animal that's just finding out what it's going to be. That's a separate process. We're not presuming to judge how that's going to turn out, so we're just showing a few examples here of the kinds of buildings that can go into that kind of. There's quite a few examples already of older industrial areas that are transitioning to a more walkable employment district with and without housing. We've been working for the last few years on one in Mountain View where you've got an industrial area similar to this that it's called the North Bay Shore, and that's where Google's headquarters is. And so we've done a plan there to systematically evolve the old 70s industrial park into a walkable, transit-oriented community with a lot of employment and a lot of housing and a ton of transit. I'm not saying that's what the Golden State District's going to become, but that's one example of the kinds of direction it could head, where you're turning old industrial streets into streets that look like that. This is an example of a building. It's sort of a drab building, I must tell you. The trees will grow. It's not but there's a whole bunch of buildings of that general type south of the 880 in Oakland, around Jack London Square, where it's an older industrial area that's had a lot of housing, and it's turning into a pretty cool mixed-use neighborhood, and it's near a lot of transit. So that's the sort of thing that the Golden State District might become, or it might not. And the possibility there, and probably also the possibility of this sort of live-work facilities could certainly happen also over around Lake and Flower on the other side of the freeway from downtown. You've got a lot of jobs in that area, and if there were some opportunities for people to live there also, that would be, a few less people that would be commuting in from wherever they're commuting in from to earn a good living in Burbank. So we'd ask you to think about how new commercial amenities being added into employment centers and new housing being added into existing employment centers could be helpful in improving the quality of life for people who work there, could improve the economics of your community by supporting that employment base. And the last thing I'll say is that it's not just millennials that want to live in mixed-use places like this. I've got a very personal example. My son and his wife and their 2-week-old baby live just next to Culver City, and they walk almost all the time for almost all their errands. My mom, at the other end of the spectrum, lives in a retirement community because we spent a year looking for a place where she could live in an environment like we're talking about here and walk to the coffee shop and walk to errands. We couldn't find one. So she's living in a little 55 and older neighborhood, which is very nice. She's made a ton of friends. She's very happy, but she has to drive everywhere. And I would rather that she not drive so much, because for her sake and the sake of others. So anyway, there's a lot of reasons to make places that you can function and thrive without driving everywhere. And that's really what we're talking about here, and trying to find out how that idea fits with Burbank. It fits differently with every community. And you don't get stuff that fits your community unless you have standards.
Cool, thanks, Dave. So the next activity is stations. So we've got 4 stations around the room where you can, we've got about 40 or 45 minutes where there'll be somebody from the consultant team and someone from the city at each one of the stations. And you can go up to the station and write your comments on the poster or discuss opportunities or priorities amongst yourself, and we'll take notes again and report back again. So it's important for us to hear what your ideas are, but it's equally important for you to hear what your other community members' ideas might be. It's really cool to have a mix of people in the room. So the 4 stations are downtown over there, the media district here, Golden State specific plan area there, and then generally just small scale mixed use. And again, you can please move around the stations as you feel comfortable, or and engage in conversation. We'll take notes and we'll report back again. It's kind of cool here that we've seen a lot of consistencies, walkability, open space, affordability, were some of the huge parking, were some of the 4 or 5 really super hot topics that came up. Those are the things that are important for you, and we will make sure that they're evident in the planning documents. So get started, 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll report back. Thank you. So we're going to reconvene in about a few minutes. So start to think about what the priorities are at each one of these stations. We're going to have to, someone's going to have to report back. So start to wrap up the priorities. We'll try to hit the top 10 priorities at each one of the stations, and then report back. And Melanie and I will make note of your input. Hello, hello. So we'll start reporting back on this. I'll kick things off. This downtown station, the top priorities here. And again, we're just going to roll through the top priorities. We got some really good notes here, and we got some great input. So in the downtown area, Burbank Center area, the top priorities were design. Design is really important. We don't want ugly buildings. That was one of the top comments. So something that's more organic, attractive. It's got a warm, homey look. Not the kind of homey you're thinking of, the home-like. So design is super important. Getting parking off the streets, and I think that these comments about parking were more pedestrian-oriented streets that are more attractive, sidewalks that are wider, benches, trees. That was really important. I think that rolled in there in one of the top 2 or 3 issues. Obviously, shops and services on the ground floor and residents above. It was felt that people came to this station, felt that was an appropriate configuration for the downtown. Again, trees, canopy, trees, shade, attractive sidewalks, open space, again, even in the downtown was important. Not so much open space, but gathering spaces. Spaces somewhat you can go and eat your lunch or meet somebody, where there's potentially some cultural things going on, like music or dance. Traffic congestion. There was a concern for traffic congestion. We don't want to increase. We don't want to increase traffic. There was a question too of building residential so close to the freeways and some of the concerns with air quality. Certainly something we took note of, and appropriate interface between commercial and retail and our neighborhoods. So there were a couple, near Burbank High and Whole Foods were examples that maybe could have been improved on, that they should have been more appropriate in their interface with the neighborhood. That's the top priorities I think we got here. If I missed anything, if anybody thinks, and another question was, how many people live in Burbank? How many people live in Burbank? Cool. Excellent. Thank you. Do we want to hit Lindsay? Thank you.
So for the media district, I think we heard probably the most common topic actually was about this idea of having kind of public spaces and having them be green, as well as kind of how they would be managed between whether they were private public kind of partnerships or not, and concerns around when they are on private property, how that might be managed or relate to how people actually use the space. Additionally, similar comment about the proximity to freeways and having concerns about placing housing near freeways. But this idea of housing in this area serving at least some of the people who are employed in this area, there was a comment or two about that. I think the biggest kind of conversation also that happened about this area was kind of this, really it has to do with transit service for this district, and how there is kind of the others, like downtown has a core, and it's very clear there's a core and there's services to get there. But for this media district area, while there are bus services, it is kind of lacking this core central area that's identifiable, and that potentially transit services in this area could be beneficial, especially if they connect to other areas of the city or to the Red Line or any other area nearby. And then additionally, some comments about taking characteristics of certain types of development that's desirable. So in this case, one gentleman and I were talking about there's a kind of a residential community kind of on the west side, and how some elements of that community, while the scale of it may not be fitting for the middle of the media district, there are elements of it that could be translated into the standards. So I think that pretty much sums up what we heard.
Next, we have the Golden State District. Thank you, Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott. Just to talk a little bit about the Golden State District, it's a unique in that the district's primarily industrial with some residential along the edges. So there was just a lot of questions as to is it even an appropriate place to have residential, which was a good conversation because it's near the airport. There's already industrial in the area. There's a lot of jobs in the area, and how do we protect the jobs? And if people do move in, how do we protect them from the airport noise and other noise-producing items in the area? Also, people were talking this about in general about the Golden State District, how there's a lack of greenery, and we'd like to see more greenery in the area, introduced in the area, better spaces to walk and gather. There were some mixed messages about whether it should be more density or not. Some people were okay with it. Other people were concerned about increasing density in the area. Some people are comfortable with more small-scale development in the area. But overall, I think there was this, I can sense it's unsure as to where the residential would go. It'd be like wasn't really a consensus as to what would be appropriate in that area. So.
Hi, I'm Shipra. So the vision for small-scale mixed-use development included vibrant public spaces with presence of trees, shades, planting buffer wherever required, seating areas for people to hang out, wider sidewalks and fewer cars, places with more character, more diverse uses, with architectural design serving a specific purpose, variation in massing and shouldn't look boring or look industrial, pathways needs to get lighted, and yeah, the focus was more on presence of trees and nature around such spaces.
Thank you very much. So I think with that, Dave's gonna. Oh, Lindsay. Take over.
So I'm just going to close this out today. Just talking about the next steps. So, thank you all for coming and participating. This was really informative and helpful, and was a great discussion today. And I think this will definitely help us in moving forward with going to the next phase, which will be with the planning board and city council at study sessions. So we are tentatively scheduled to go to the planning board on October 23rd and to city council on November 14th. Those dates will be posted on the project web page on our website. In addition to that, so essentially with this information, we summarize what happened today at this workshop, and we'll present it to the planning board and council and get feedback so that we can move forward in developing the actual vision for these standards in these different areas. And from there, we will then move forward in actually developing the framework of the standards, at which point we'll have another another workshop in January where we ask you more specifics of those standards and what they may look like or how they might be framed. So with that, I want to thank you all again. And if you have any questions, please let me know. There should be individual participant surveys on your desks. If you guys could fill those out and drop them in the box while you're walking out the door, that would be great. And if you had any comment cards as well that you filled out, if you could provide those to us as well. Thank you again. Have a good weekend.